From the very beginning, from the gray hospital walls where she was brought as a teenager, from that first uncomfortable glance from the doctor who didn't want to be cruel but couldn't lie either, from that slippery phrase, "For now, her condition is stable, but the outlook is unfavorable," from that night when the nurse quietly said her mother was crying in the hallway but asked not to be disturbed, from the first time she realized that discharge didn't mean freedom, just a temporary pause. Everything around her existed with the shadow of an unspoken prognosis. It was this silent contract that everyone in the room seemed to sign, the doctors, the family, even the friends, when they didn't say what they truly thought, but only what couldn't hurt, though it hurt even more. When instead of words, they offered tea, instead of discussions, a stroke on the hand, instead of real, "How are you?" a procedural, "Hang in there." And she understood from the very start that no one would ever say the deadline out loud, but they would all live as if they knew it, as if the clock was ticking, not just in IV drips measured by milliliters, but in possibilities slowly being replaced by dashes. The older she got, the quieter their conversations about the future became. First, they avoided talking about summer camps, then college, then jobs, then relationships, as if it wasn't malice but simply unwise optimism. And she didn't get angry, didn't resist, because she realized before everyone else the pain of silence can sometimes be more honest than words. And in that silence, she learned to live, not hoping, not expecting, not planning, just living by her own internal rhythm, by signs no one else noticed, by the color of her skin in the morning, by the light in the window, by how her body breathed at 5 a.m., by how her finger responded to the cold, by the tiny things that weren't indicators of diagnosis but of life itself. And because she wasn't waiting for a later, she felt the now so sharply. This now wasn't an escape, wasn't some caricature of carpe diem. It was real deliberate breathing, the kind of breathing of someone who knows every second is not a step toward something else. It is the goal. She didn't chase madness. She didn't seek thrills. She simply learned how to live fully. In half the energy others wasted on fear. And that's why, when she turned 25, and all those who once tiptoed around the truth suddenly began to praise her strength as if only now her life had become amazing. She didn't say anything grand. She just replied, "I just didn't want to spend what was left of my time waiting for the end. It was easier to just start living." And it wasn't a protest, it wasn't a philosophy. It was grit, dense like skin, strong like a scar. And from that moment, they began listening to her differently, not because she'd become a hero, but because standing next to her made it unbearable to lie to themselves. Because she, living beside death, could see life more clearly than those who ran from it into health, careers, likes, distractions. Because she, as if burning through you with her gaze, could ask one question without saying a word. "Are you really living?" And that question changed more than any diagnosis, more than any deadline, more than any doctor ever could. Because her breath didn't need a miracle, it was a miracle, endured, accepted, understood. And from that moment on, everything began to change. Not around her, but inside those who thought they were healthy. He walked into the room like an ordinary man in a white coat, no better and no worse than the others, with a straight back, with control in his voice, with intelligent speech and a soft smile, too practiced to be genuine, with eyes that revealed the fatigue of dealing with those who hold on, who fight, who write stories, because for him it had long become a conveyor belt. He spoke not in words, but in patterns, not in phrases, but in protocols. And when he looked in on her, he expected nothing special, just another patient, another chart, another, the dynamics are stable but under observation, another smile, another, "You're doing great." But when he entered, and she simply looked at him, not turning away, not looking from under her brow, not frozen and not pleading, but with a kind of inhuman, warm, almost forgiving gaze that seemed to say, "I've known for a long time what you're going to say. I don't need to hear it. What matters to me is this. Who are you, really, when it's all over?" He suddenly couldn't say his standard line. It stuck in his throat like a dusty feather, impossible to swallow and impossible to spit out. He suddenly felt he couldn't behave the way he usually did, couldn't just walk in and out, couldn't separate himself intellectually from the situation, because her silence didn't let go, didn't demand, didn't accuse, but held him in its field, as if life itself, through her, was looking at him and asking, "Are you sure you're living the way you want to?" And that question wasn't spoken aloud, but it was in every breath she took, in how she held her cup of tea, in how she blinked infrequently but deeply, as if every time she closed her eyes it wasn't from fatigue, but to see something inside that couldn't be seen from the outside. And he, experienced, tired, rational, left the room with trembling fingers, as if he had lost something, or rather, as if he had remembered something long forgotten, hidden under layers of everyday routine. And the whole day he carried with him the feeling that he had just met someone who was closer to the truth than all the healthy people he had ever known. And when he came home that evening, turned on the light, undressed, put the kettle on, he suddenly realized he was sitting in the kitchen and couldn't turn on the TV, couldn't scroll through the news, couldn't return to the usual, because she hadn't needed to say anything to change everything. He remembered how she just looked at him as if saying, "There's more in you than you show the world, and you know it. You've just been living too long, as if you have infinite time for later." And that thought struck him so deeply that he went to bed in silence. No phone, no tablet, just lay down, and for the first time in many years tried to hear the silence he lived in. And it was in that silence, in her unasked question, that his slow shift began. Because it's not the diagnosis that changes people, but the encounter with those who are not afraid to truly live, even when they have almost no time left. She never asked anyone to come, never called, never begged, never rang the bells of charity, never wrote posts, never published black and white photos with an IV, never made drama out of what happened every day. Because for her, the diagnosis wasn't news or punishment. It was something as ordinary as the change of seasons. She simply lived inside it, without trying to be strong, and it was precisely because of that that people were drawn to her room, first out of duty, then out of curiosity, then out of an inexplicable pull to just be near her. Because everyone who entered with the intention to support, uplift, or speak with an inspiring person would find, after half an hour, that they were not the ones supporting, not the ones teaching, not the ones bringing light, but rather they themselves were beginning to understand something, to see deeper, to hear themselves in the silence. And it wasn't because she said the right things. On the contrary, she barely spoke. She just answered briefly but honestly. She just looked. She just breathed nearby in a way that said she had nowhere to rush to, because she had long understood that what matters isn't speed, it's depth. And so a young journalist comes in, 26 years old, with a recorder, a notebook, with phrases like, "We want to tell your inspiring story." And Varya nods, smiles a little, looks away, not out of shyness, but because she knows. This won't be a meeting with her, but with oneself. Because within 10 minutes, the journalist stops writing and just sits there, stops asking questions and starts talking about how she's afraid to change careers, how she's had anxiety since childhood, how her parents pressure her, how she's not sure she's living her own life. And Varya doesn't interrupt, doesn't say, "Be strong," doesn't offer advice. She just listens, truly, deeply, without expectations. And after half an hour, the journalist is crying, smudging mascara into her notes, saying, "Why is this the first time I've felt that I'm not living the way I could?" And Varya replies, "Because you always thought there was still time. I know I might not have time." And there is no pathos in that phrase, no tragedy, only pure shining truth. And the girl leaves not with a story, but with a new life in her hands, unwrapped, but already real. And this happened more than once. Volunteers would come thinking they were bringing light, but would then sit down unsure of what to say, because her light had no slogans, no banners. It simply was inside her, in how she looked at the window, how she said, "Honey water is better than coffee," how she folded the blanket after every shift as if it were the last one, how she thanked the nurse for a clean sheet, not like a patient, but like a person who knows. This is care, and it deserves thanks while you still can. And everyone who came to help left with something inside them that hadn't been there before, and didn't even know that now they couldn't go on living the old way. But the most important thing, she didn't see it, or didn't want to see it, because she never set out to save anyone. She understood the one who saves is not the one who promises, but the one who simply stays close to the truth, even when that truth becomes someone else's confession brought in for work, because a diagnosis doesn't make someone magical. It makes them a point of crystalline clarity where you can't lie, can't pretend, can't stay the same. And that's exactly why those who were healthy left her different. And she continued to live between the fourth and the morning, between weakness and forgiveness, between what no one promised her and what she never demanded from anyone, yet still gave more than she received, because what she gave wasn't words, wasn't advice, but silence, in which a person began to hear themselves. When a man once walked into her room wearing an expensive coat, with phones in both hands, carrying the look of someone who always knows what to say, what to ask, and how to enter any situation, as if even suffering could be explained by logic. She immediately sensed it. He was afraid, not of illness, not of test results, not of diagnosis, but of silence. Because only in silence could he hear what he had been running from for too many years. He was the brother of one of the patients who had been moved to the floor above and had just decided to stop by. But his hands trembled, lingering too long on the phone screen, and when he asked, "How are you holding up?" she replied calmly, as if she had known the question long ago. "I'm no longer holding on, I just am." And in those words, there was neither philosophy nor defiance nor wisdom. It was the concentration of her experience in a single sentence. Because the strength people so often asked her about wasn't courage, wasn't perseverance, wasn't a fight. It was the fact that she had stopped hiding from pain, had learned to breathe within it, like someone lost in fog who no longer tries to escape, but simply walks, because they understand there's no other way. And that man, it seemed, didn't hear her. But half an hour later, he was still sitting in the chair by her bed, no longer asking questions, no longer looking at his phone, just staring out the window. And then he suddenly said, "I always told her she had to stay strong, and all this time, I was never actually there." And in that sentence was all his burned out armor, because beside her, you couldn't stay armored. Her presence dissolved defenses, not because she spoke the truth, but because she was the truth. Every breath, every blink, every phrase like, "I'm not waiting, I'm just here." All of it broke down walls more than any psychologist could. And he went on. "I thought that if I earned, if I provided, if I solved things, that would be enough. And now she's up there. And maybe that was the last time I saw her. And I wasn't even with her. Not really. Not once." And she didn't nod, didn't comfort, didn't say it'll be okay. She just looked, steadily, quietly, a little sadly, like someone who knows that pain doesn't require answers. It requires endurance. And in that moment, he cried for the first time in many years, silently, quietly, like a boy who had played the strong one for too long and was tired and covering his face with his hands. He said, "I'm so scared, but not of death. I'm afraid I haven't lived my own life." And then she said, "I don't have time for someone else's. That's why I live my own, even if it's short. But you have your whole life and you're hiding. That's why the pain will catch you." And he didn't argue for the first time in his adult life, because for the first time he had heard a voice that wasn't trying to convince him, just standing beside his fear without leaving. And it was then that he understood that strength isn't in not crying, not in knowing everything or solving everything, but in not turning away from pain, especially when it already lives inside you. Because pain is not an enemy. It simply reminds you that you are alive. And when he left, he didn't say thank you, didn't promise to return. He just said, "For the first time, I understand why you breathe so calmly. You gave yourself permission to simply be without struggle." And she smiled, not out of pleasure, but out of recognition. In that moment, he had become real for the first time, and that meant everything she had lived for, even in a body that ached every day, had not been in vain. She never promised that everything would be okay, never said, "You'll get through this," never recited mantras, never handed out hope in packages of warm words, because she knew how silence sounds when a doctor leaves the room and says nothing, how your hand trembles when you read further treatment, palliative, how your whole body stops being yours and becomes an object of discussion, numbers, histology, schedules. And that's why she knew words don't heal, especially words you don't believe in yourself. And precisely because of that, when people sat next to her, at first politely, with distance, with the usual, "How are you holding up? What do you dream about? How do you spend your days?" and received in response a short, "I live," without embellishments, without drama, without theater, they were first taken aback and then began to breathe deeper, as if, for the first time, realizing that the air was real, that the room wasn't just a backdrop, but a space where no one demanded strength, cheerfulness, or inspiration. And it was then that something unlocked inside them, as if life itself, compressed by years of anxiety, ambition, and hurry, began to stretch again, to open, to bloom. And one man from another room, with severe post-operative depression, who hadn't spoken in weeks, one day sat across from her and asked, "Are you afraid?" And she answered, "No, I'm just going where everyone eventually goes. I'm just not running. I'm watching." And in that watching was more strength than in thousands of therapy sessions, more truth than in motivational talks, more life than in books, because she wasn't trying to return health to someone. She was returning their breath, returning the sense that even if there's not much time left, that little bit can be real, not forced, not hidden, not borrowed. And in that little bit, there was often an entire universe. Because when one teenager with a diagnosis of panic attacks finally dared to speak to her after a failed suicide attempt, he said, "I just don't believe I have a reason to live." She didn't say, "Life is beautiful," she asked. "Did you see yesterday's light in the window? It looked like amber. Did you notice it?" And he was surprised that this mattered, and she continued, "If you didn't see it, then you still have at least one evening left to see it." And he stayed, not because of the beauty of the phrase, but because for the first time someone didn't persuade him, didn't impose anything, but simply offered to stay for the sake of one color in the glass. And that is how, not through inspiration, not through healing, but through attention to life itself, just as it is, she gave people back not their health, but their desire to live. Because health is a function, but the desire to live is a choice. And next to her, that choice became possible because she didn't resist pain, but didn't let it be the only thing. And those who left her room didn't become saved, didn't shout, "She changed my life." They simply began to feel alive. And that was enough. Because even without a diagnosis, many hadn't truly lived in a long time. And only after meeting her, they began to. It was supposed to be an ordinary letter, another request from some organization, polite, well written, with phrases like, "The public needs people like you. Your example can inspire thousands. You can change people's perspective on life." And they weren't lying. They truly had good intentions. They wanted to invite her to some award ceremony, bring her on stage, place her in the spotlight, say, "Look, she's alive despite everything." And she read the letter, placed it on the windowsill, looked at the sky, and didn't answer for a long time, because she knew if she agreed, there would be a photo, then a post, then comments, then someone would say, "Inspiring, proud of people like her, learn how to live like this," but not one of them would ask what it's like to live when your body gives out a little more each day, what it's like to wake up not knowing whether the next week will be easier or harder, what it's like to breathe when every inhale takes effort. And she knew that on stage they wouldn't ask how pain becomes a shadow, wouldn't ask why she never says, "I fight, only I stay." They would look and see not her, but their own fear temporarily soothed. And that's exactly why she said no, not because she was against light, not because she feared cameras, but because she knew her silence should not become a product, should not be packaged into motivational content, because she was alive, not a heroine, not an example, just alive. And if someone truly wanted to hear her, They came quietly, without spotlights, without agendas, simply sat next to her and breathed. And those were the real encounters. The stage, it's always a backdrop, always an expectation of applause that rings louder than meaning. And she wrote, "Thank you for the invitation, but I don't want my life to be used as an excuse for others to forget their own." And she didn't explain further because there's no need to explain anything to those who truly feel. And it was then, in the room, that a nurse, long used to chaos and burnout, for the first time stayed with her after her shift, just to sit, and said, "You probably don't want everyone to know you, but you're the first person who ever made me want to stop, not just survive the routine." And Varya looked at her, smiled slightly, and replied, "If you stay, that's enough. For me, and for yourself too." And from that moment, another circle began. Not public, not media worthy, not award based, but real. Because when a person who lives on the edge says no to the stage, but says yes to one real gaze, that's when true change begins, not global, but human, not massive, but pinpointed. And that is what later grows, takes root. Because the silence in which an honest no is spoken is much louder than all the lacks and headlines. Because sometimes it is refusal that inspires more than a loud, "I made it." Because honesty is not a show. It's the decision to remain yourself when you're being called to become a symbol. He came in by accident, you could say, by mistake, having mixed up the rooms. He was a volunteer, an intern at a foundation, young and fast, with good intentions and restless eyes. He liked doing good things and was proud of himself for it. He wore a warm hoodie with the charity project's logo, talked a lot, walked quickly, was genuinely shocked by how patients lived, and at the same time constantly felt an inner need to explain everything he saw with words, even pain, to describe it, even fear, to analyze it, even laugh, to plan it. But when he walked into her room and saw that she was simply sitting by the window, holding a book she wasn't reading, just holding, he began, by habit, with his verbal module. "Hello, I'm from the foundation. May I speak with you for a bit? We're here to—" But didn't finish because she didn't turn around immediately, not out of indifference, but for some other reason. As if she knew that in this pace no one really hears, that words spoken too quickly don't reach their destination. And he, not even understanding why, suddenly went quiet, sat on the edge of a chair, froze, as if, for the first time, he felt that there was no need to say anything, no need to offer anything, no need to chase after a response, that he could simply be there. And she turned to him, looked, not with a smile, not with judgment, but the way you look at a person you don't know, but no longer fear. And in that gaze, there was something he had never encountered in any of his peers, no need to explain himself, because she didn't demand anything, didn't expect him to be right, didn't ask him to be useful. And it was precisely for that reason that, for the first time, he stayed not as a volunteer, not as a helper, not as a representative of a good mission, but as a person who had suddenly been allowed to simply exist. And it felt so new that he felt how the tension in his body slid off, how his hands stopped fidgeting, how the voice inside that always comments on everything suddenly went quiet. And they sat like that for 10 minutes, maybe more, in silence. And during that time, he felt as if something inside him, for the first time, had opened, something that had long been buried under schedules, routine, conversations, as if his very essence had returned to the room, to that small space where he didn't have to be smart or useful or cheerful. And at some point, he couldn't hold it in and said, "I'm always running, always trying to do something important. But with you, I don't want to do anything. Just sit." And she, without smiling, simply nodded. And that nod was enough, because it was the only time someone had heard not his words, but the silence behind them. And for the first time, he understood how much in life sounds but isn't heard, how often he spoke without knowing why, how often he listened just to respond, not to truly hear. And that evening he left different, not because she taught him something, not because she gave advice, not because she opened his eyes, but because she said nothing, and in doing so, gave him the one thing he'd been missing: the chance to be next to himself, real, without obligations, without format, without purpose, just be. And as he was leaving, he turned back and asked, "How do you endure such silence?" And she smiled for the first time, truly, warmly, and said, "Haven't you heard how much lives in it?" And he nodded, because now he had heard. And from that moment on, he stopped speaking, just to fill silence, stopped writing posts to prove he cared, stopped rushing just to feel needed, and began to simply be present, honest, open, real. And he didn't even notice how he became someone to whom people began to entrust their pain, not out of pity, but because being near him now felt safe. She never asked for flowers, chocolates, words of encouragement, never expected postcards, never hung motivational quotes above her bed, never played healing background music, never cut out paper angels or taped photos of smiling friends on the white wall, because she knew none of that would hold you if you hadn't learned to hold yourself from within. She didn't decorate the space because she understood that in emptiness, breath is louder, and in that transparent, honest, almost monastic simplicity, something strange began to happen. People who came to her seemingly by chance, orderlies, nurses, interns, even couriers bringing tests or deliveries, would stay, linger, remain silent longer than usual. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but then it became a pattern because no one could stay superficial around her. Not a single polite smile could withstand her gaze, a gaze with no reproach, no pity, not even hope. Only a very steady, hard-earned truth. And in that truth, a person either fell apart or became whole. And one day, an orderly, a woman with a tired face and a brisk gait, who always complained she had no time, that everything was dumped on her, that patients were ungrateful, suddenly stayed with her after her shift, just stood at the window and looked into the dark glass rectangle, and suddenly said, "You know, I've been running for years, always thinking, just a bit more, and I'll finally be able to breathe. And then I look at you and realize that you're already breathing, and I am not." And Varya simply replied, "You're not too late. As long as you're alive, anything is possible." And from that moment on, this woman stopped cursing her shifts, stopped banging the cart, began to speak more softly, more attentively, and a month later came and brought her a warm knitted shawl, not bought, but made with her own hands, for the first time in many years because her hands finally wanted to create again, not just serve. And such moments became more frequent. A man from security, silent and gruff, once brought her a thermos of tea, even though the rules forbade it, and simply said, "I don't know why, but when I walk past your room, it somehow feels lighter." And she nodded, not because she was surprised, but because she was used to it. People brought what she didn't have, because they felt that in her silence, they could leave their truth, without fear, without shame, without packaging. And one day, a former doctor came, no longer practicing, burned out, gray-haired, tired, worn down, but with eyes where a weak spark still flickered. He stood at the door for a long time, then came in, sat down, said nothing, just looked at her hands, thin, pale, but alive, not trembling, and then said, "I treated people for 40 years, and only here did I realize I never knew what it meant to simply be there." And she didn't answer, because he no longer needed an explanation. He just stayed sitting beside her, as if, through that, he was reclaiming something very important. And now, more and more often, the people who appeared in her room weren't those who wanted to heal, but those who just wanted to remember what it meant to live. And they brought not words, not help, not optimism, but presence. And that became what she valued most. Not things, but people who weren't trying to be someone, but were simply being, and strangely enough, that saved her more than procedures. Because in that quiet, subtle exchange of presence, something real happened. Life was born, even in the place where no one expected it anymore. Her name wasn't written in articles. Her face didn't flash on screens. Her room didn't become a set for stories about medical miracles. No one filmed interviews with her. She didn't give inspiring speeches, didn't speak at forums. She wasn't invited to be the face of charity campaigns. And this wasn't because she was overlooked, but because it was her choice. Varya knew real change doesn't need announcements, and so she simply lived as she always had, in silence, in observation, in respect for every person who crossed the threshold of her room. And it was precisely because she didn't try to become someone's quote or social media post, because she didn't sell her pain disguised as strength, that the people who met her began to change, slowly, inexplicably, but deeply, as if an old, long forgotten door opened within them, a door that had always been there but had gathered dust beneath anxieties, roles, and the fear of not being enough. And with Varya, they suddenly remembered who they were when no one was watching, who they had been before they put on the uniform, the name, the successful mask, who they were without the rush, without the reports, without the race. That's how it was with the young intern who at first came to her as just another patient, and after 2 weeks was sitting by the windowsill sharing poems she'd never shown anyone, and once said, "I thought I wrote badly, now I understand. I was just afraid of silence, and near you, it's not scary." And with the security guard, who had seemed rough and silent, but after a few shifts, suddenly started saying hello for real, not formally, but with a look of recognition, and one day simply left an apple on her nightstand. No note, not as a gift, but as a sign. And even those who didn't know her by name, who were just passing by, would suddenly stop, look toward the door, as if sensing that inside was not just a hospital room, but something more, a place where you didn't have to be someone else. And that feeling grew, like ripples on water, spreading through the floor, through the corridors, through the people, and it seemed that she had become the point from which a new movement began, not toward healing, but toward remembering. Because Varya didn't heal bodies, she brought souls back into them, the ones forgotten in the chase for normalcy. And it didn't happen quickly, didn't look dramatic, but it was irreversible. People went to her as one person and left, a little quieter, a little softer, a little more themselves. And one day, when the head nurse was filling out the checkup schedule, she paused at Varya's name, thought for a moment, and said, "You know, everyone here has diagnoses, but she feels like meaning. She's like an anchor, not flashy, but if you remove her, everyone starts drifting." And that held more truth than any report, because Varya, unnoticed from the outside, became a pillar from within. And one day, when a boy of about 7, the son of the woman in the next bed, walked into her room and stood by her bed, staring without blinking, she asked, "Why are you so quiet?" And he replied, "I just feel like here, you can be real. At home, the TV's always on and it's loud. I hide there. But here, I don't have to." And she nodded, because she knew this is what matters most. To be a place where no one hides, even if you yourself don't yet understand that it's a gift, not a diagnosis. Because she didn't become a legend, not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to become something for everyone, so she could become something real for each person who walked in and walked out changed. It happened just the way she may have wanted, without announcement, without sudden panic, without violent agony, without a flurry of doctors and nurses, without tubes and noises. Simply one evening became the last, simply night turned into morning. But with her, the silence remained the same. And when the nurse at the station noticed the monitor wasn't glowing and walked into the room, everything was as it always was. The blanket neatly folded at her feet, the book resting on her chest, open to the very page she often reread, the window slightly ajar, and on the windowsill, a cup still warm, with honey and water, and her face wasn't the face of someone gone, wasn't the face of a victor or a loser. It was the face of someone who had simply done everything they could and left not into shadow, but into light. And there was so much clarity in it that the nurse didn't cry at first. She just stood there, holding the door handle, as if afraid to disturb the silence in which something was still resonating. And when the others came, the orderly, the on-call doctor, the foundation coordinator, no one shouted, no one rushed, because everyone felt This was not a loss, it was a passage. And that's why no one said, "She's gone," because she was in the air, in the walls, in the girl from the next room, who now herself went up to the new patient and said, "Are you scared? Come on, I'll sit with you." And in the security guard who started greeting every patient in the corridor by name, and in the orderly who now brought apples not by instruction, but just because, and in those who kept coming to her room even after, sitting on the edge of the bed and staying silent as if something remained unsaid, not out of guilt, but out of meaning, because sometimes what matters doesn't need words. And one day, the same young doctor who didn't believe in miracles came in, sat in the same chair as before, and said aloud, "I don't know what happened to me, but after her, I can't work the same way. I now hear not the heartbeat, but the silence, and in it, she's always there." And so each, in their own way, confessed that she remained, not as a saintly image, not as a tragic figure, but as an inner turning point, as the moment when a person suddenly stops being afraid to be alive. And the foundations didn't launch projects in her name, and no plaque was hung on the building, and no street was renamed. But one day, someone placed an old lamp in the lobby with soft light and a little note. "For those who just want to sit in silence, you can here." And that note stayed for a long time. No one took it down, no one replaced it, no one rewrote it. And people came there, not for grand gestures, not for faith, but for themselves. Because those who knew her knew. Real change never shouts, it simply stays inside us. And each of them now lived differently, not because someone told them how to, but because once they had been beside someone who lived as if every now was the last. And that's why it was whole. And now, when someone stayed quiet longer than usual, no one was afraid. On the contrary, they slowed down because they understood silence can be a voice. And in that silence, Varya continued to live, not as a legend, not as a miracle, but as a simple, real woman who didn't heal others, but showed how not to be afraid to live, even if every day is the last. And if someone were ever asked, "Did you know Varya?" they wouldn't say she was a hero. They would say, "One day she didn't say anything, and I started hearing myself." And that was the truth. And it was this truth that now lived in everyone who had met her, even just once.